North Africa, 1942. The sun scorched the endless desert. The war Yankee seemed predictable. The Germans believed their machines were flawless, their engineering unmatched, their victory inevitable. Then one morning, soldiers dragged in a strange, boxy vehicle, an American Jeep, captured on the battlefield. The mechanics laughed. Let's see what kind of junk the Americans build. But when they opened the hood, the laughter stopped. Silence spread. Faces changed. What they saw inside shattered their faith in German superiority. Because in that single moment, they realized this wasn't just a car. It was America's real secret weapon. Stay till the end. Because this Jeep didn't just change a battle, it changed the entire war. At the start of World War II, Germany prided itself on precision. Every tank, every plane, a masterpiece of engineering. Their soldiers trusted the perfection of their machines. But that Jeep, ugly, simple, and covered in dust, told a different story. It wasn't built to impress. It was built to survive. The desert wind was still. Sand hissed softly against metal as a small group of German mechanics circled the captured vehicle. It looked unimpressive, short, boxy, crude. Nothing like the polished lines of their own Kübelwagens. This? One of them sneered. This is what the Americans send into battle? Another chuckled, brushing the dust off the hood. Maybe it runs on Coca-Cola, he joked. The men laughed. They were soldiers of the Afrika Korps, veterans of Rommel's proud army. Their confidence in German engineering was absolute. Mercedes, Opel, Messerschmitt. Their machines were symbols of order, precision, perfection. The idea that an American vehicle, something mass-produced by factory workers, could rival German craftsmanship was ridiculous. But that arrogance lasted only a few seconds. With a sharp clang, the hood latch lifted. One of the men leaned in, then froze. The laughter faded. Inside wasn't chaos. It wasn't crude. It was clean, simple, logical. The engine layout was so straightforward that even a farmhand could understand it. No hidden parts. No delicate wiring. Just raw functional engineering. Das ist unglaublich, one whispered. Another leaned closer, wiping away a layer of sand from the side plate. He read the manufacturer's mark, Willys Overland Motors. Who even are these people? He murmured. Then came the real shock. The realization that this wasn't a handmade masterpiece. It was built to be replaced, not worshipped. Everything about it screamed efficiency. The bolts were standardized, everyone the same size. The tools needed? Basic wrenches, nothing specialized. The entire vehicle could be stripped down and rebuilt in a single day, maybe even in the field. That's it? One mechanic muttered under his breath. That's genius. The others looked up, surprised. He wasn't mocking anymore. He was admiring. For the first time, German precision had met American practicality and lost, because this Jeep wasn't designed by perfectionists. It was designed by realists. In Germany, every part was custom fit. A single damaged gear meant a week of repair. In this Jeep, if something broke, you replaced it. Fast. Any soldier could fix it. No special training, no engineering degree. That single difference yet was the beginning of a much bigger truth. The Germans had built machines that demanded respect. The Americans had built machines that demanded results. The Jeep was small, yes, but it could go anywhere. Through mud, over rocks, across rivers. It didn't stall in the heat. It didn't choke on dust. It just kept going. One soldier kicked. The tire was solid. Another tugged at the seat. Leather, but worn tough. The steering felt loose, but it turned with the confidence of something that had already seen hell and come back running. It looks cheap, one of them finally said. Exactly, another replied. That's why they can build thousands. And that was the moment the room, or rather the desert, went silent again, because they all knew what that meant. Germany's factories were few. Each vehicle took time, skill, precision. But if America could make thousands of these every month, the math was brutal. It didn't matter how perfect a tank was. If the enemy had 10 more before you, even finished one, and all of it started right there in that engine bay, the Jeep wasn't a luxury. It was a philosophy. A machine built not for pride, but for purpose. Later, when reports reached the high command, one engineer wrote in his diary, "They have sacrificed elegance for endurance, and they will win because of it." In that moment, the Germans understood something they had never seen before, a different kind of genius, not the kind that carved steel with precision, but the kind that could build an empire overnight. The Jeep didn't need to look powerful. It was powerful. It could be dropped from planes, pulled from mud, fixed in an hour, and sent back into combat. Every nut, every screw told the same story. Don't admire me. Use me. And the soldiers who laughed earlier? They weren't laughing anymore. One of them leaned on the fender, staring at the engine, silent for a long time. Then he whispered, almost to himself, "We build for perfection. They built for victory." The rest didn't answer. They didn't need to. The realization was already sinking in. They were fighting a war of craftsmanship against a nation that had mastered mass production. And in that kind of war, perfection doesn't win. Numbers do. The Jeep was more than a vehicle. It was a message, a quiet declaration from across the ocean that said, "You can have your pride. We'll take the future." And in that dusty desert, surrounded by broken trucks and burning tanks, the soldiers of the Afrika Korps finally saw it, not in the form of a weapon, but in the shape of a small, unassuming machine that was built to last and built to win. The hangar smelled of oil and dust. A captured Jeep sat in the middle of the room, surrounded by officers and engineers in gray uniforms. They circled, in the way one might circle a wild animal, curious, cautious, a little offended. Colonel Weiss adjusted his cap and frowned. "It's ugly," he muttered. "Ugly," replied his adjutant, "but alive." He wasn't wrong. The Jeep looked rough, square edges, open wheels, a body hammered into shape with little concern for beauty. No chrome, no polish, just steel, paint, and purpose. Weiss, a man raised on the religion of German engineering, felt almost insulted. His entire life he had believed that a machine was an extension of human excellence, something crafted with discipline, precision, and respect. A machine must be perfect, he used to tell his men, because imperfection kills. That philosophy had built the Luftwaffe, the Panzer divisions, and the great industrial heart of Germany. Every part was measured, every weld inspected, every engine a work of art. And now he stood before this thing, a Jeep, a box on wheels that somehow carried armies across continents. One of the mechanics, an old veteran from Bremen, leaned over the hood and shrugged. "Herr Oberst," he said, "this could be repaired by a farmer." The colonel's eyes narrowed. "Exactly," he replied coldly. "That is the problem." But deep down, he knew it was also the solution. Because while Germany worshipped craftsmanship, America worshipped efficiency. Their machines didn't need to be beautiful. They needed to multiply. A Jeep could roll off a production line in a matter of hours. A German vehicle took days, sometimes weeks. In Berlin, engineers debated tolerances to the nearest millimeter. In Detroit, foremen shouted, "Good enough, next one." To the Germans, this sounded like blasphemy. To the Americans, it sounded like victory. And that was the true clash of philosophies, two different kinds of genius. One side built machines for the museum. The other built them for the battlefield. One prized the individual craftsman, the man with steady hands and a ruler in his soul. The other trusted the factory, the hum of thousands of hands moving in rhythm. For Germany, pride was in how something was built. For America, pride was in how many could be built. The difference may sound small, but in total war, it was everything. Because perfection takes time, and time was the one resource Germany didn't have. The Americans understood this before the war even began. They had designed a system where machines didn't last forever, but could be replaced instantly. Tanks, planes, jeeps, all built to the same rhythm. If one fell, another took its place before the smoke even cleared. In the eyes of the German engineer, this was madness. They build like children, one Luftwaffe officer wrote in his diary, but he changed his tone a year later. Children, he wrote, who can fill the sky. The Jeep, in its humble form, represented more than a vehicle. It was a statement, a declaration of industrial philosophy. It said, we don't have to build perfect machines, we only have to build enough. And in the logic of war, that made perfect sense. Imagine two soldiers. One drives a precision-made German Kübelwagen, delicate, complex, difficult to repair. The other drives a Jeep, rough, noisy, but fixable with a wrench and a bit of luck. When the Kübelwagen breaks down, it needs a specialist. When the Jeep breaks down, the driver himself becomes the mechanic. In that small detail lies the entire story of how America outbuilt the Axis. Colonel Weiss leaned against the Jeep's fender, staring at its boxy frame. It looks like a toy, he said again, but softer this time. The mechanic smiled. Maybe, he said, but it's a toy that wins wars. Weiss didn't answer. He didn't need to, because he knew. He knew that Germany's strength, its obsession with perfection, was slowly becoming its weakness. Perfection demands control. But war is chaos. And in chaos, the side that adapts fastest wins. Months later, reports came from across the front. The same story, again and again. Jeeps crossing terrain where even tanks got stuck. Jeeps hauling wounded soldiers out of fire zones. Jeeps pulling artillery, carrying messages, ferrying generals. One small machine doing the work of 10. Soldiers began calling it the mule that never dies. And back in Germany, engineers studied the blueprints in silence. It is not the machine, one of them finally said. It is the mindset. The philosophy clash wasn't just about metal and bolts. It was about how each nation thought. Germany believed in mastery. America believed in momentum. Germany built to impress. America built to overwhelm. The Germans created marvels of engineering, but too few to matter. The Americans created systems of engineering, enough to drown the battlefield. That was the real difference under the hood. Not technology, not horsepower, but philosophy. By the time Colonel Weiss retired after the war, he kept one photograph on his desk, not of a tank, not of a plane, but of that little Jeep. On the back of the photo, he had written 6 words. Simplicity, the most dangerous weapon, because he had learned the hard way that sometimes the greatest power lies not in complexity, but in clarity. And that's what the Jeep was, not a masterpiece of art, but a masterpiece of understanding, a machine that redefined war, not by being perfect, but by being possible. The train doors opened with a hiss. Cold American air rushed in, smelling of iron, oil, and smoke. The German engineers stepped out, their boots crunching on the gravel. Guards waved them forward. No shouting, no cruelty, just a quiet, efficient order. Ahead of them rose a wall of glass and steel, a factory, but not like any they had ever seen. It stretched to the horizon, windows glowing orange from the furnaces inside, the roar of machinery like a living heartbeat. Conveyor belts rattled, sparks danced. The sound was deafening, the sound of a nation creating. Mein Gott, whispered one engineer, his voice trembling. It never stops. Inside it was a world unto itself. Men and women, in overalls moved with clockwork rhythm. Some drilled rivets, others tested engines. A young girl, no older than 17, wiped grease from her cheek and gave them a quick, tired smile before turning back to her work. That smile hit them, harder than any bomb. Because in Germany, factories were sacred, cold places of discipline and hierarchy. But here, the Americans worked like a single body, fast, relentless, unstoppable. The engineers had expected chaos. They found choreography. They were led to a balcony overlooking the main assembly line. Below them, hundreds of jeeps rolled forward, frame by frame, piece by piece. The rhythm was hypnotic. Every few seconds, another one complete. Engines tested, tires fitted, seats bolted, 1 jeep, 2, 10, 20. The foreman shouted something in English, barely audible over the roar. The translator turned to the Germans. He says they finish about 600 jeeps a day. A silence fell. 600 a day. The chief engineer from Munich blinked, trying to do the math in his head. That's more than we can build in 2 months, he murmured. The translator didn't respond. He didn't need to. The numbers said everything, and then, as if to twist the knife deeper, another door opened. Beyond it was a hangar, enormous, echoing. Planes. Dozens of them lined up in perfect rows, engines gleaming, wings spread like steel, birds waiting for dawn. "These are finished?" one German asked, stunned. The American officer nodded casually. "Finished yesterday." Another door, another hall, tanks, artillery, trucks, each one polished, fueled, and ready. The Germans stood there, frozen. For the first time, they truly understood the phrase, arsenal of democracy. In Germany, war production had been a struggle, every part rationed, every hour stretched. Bombs fell, factories relocated, workers exhausted. But here, war was an industry. America wasn't fighting for survival. It was manufacturing victory. One factory produced more vehicles in a month than the Reich could in half a year. Another produced aircraft faster than Germany could replace its losses, and all of it happened without panic, without desperation, just discipline and scale. The Germans had believed they were fighting soldiers, but now they saw the truth. They were fighting a civilization of machines. "How many workers here?" one of them finally asked. The American guide smiled. 10,000 in this plant. 40 more just like it across the country." The German swallowed hard. 10,000 times 40. And this was only one kind of factory. There were others, for bullets, uniforms, engines, ships, each one roaring, day and night, fueled by something Germany could never replicate. Not oil, not manpower, but freedom of scale. That night, in their barracks, the engineers couldn't sleep. They whispered to each other, their voices low. "We can't win this," one said. "Even if we build faster, they build more." Another replied bitterly, "They don't even need victory, they can simply outlast us." No one argued, because deep down they knew the truth. The war had already been decided, not in the skies or on the beaches, but here, in the factories. Months later, one of those same engineers would stand trial in Nuremberg. When asked what moment he realized Germany had lost, he didn't mention Stalingrad. He didn't mention Normandy. He simply said, "The day I saw Detroit." The fear wasn't of the bombs or the guns. It was of the system, the machine behind the machines. America had turned the art of war into the science of production, and once that happened, no army, no matter how proud or disciplined, could stand against it. The Germans went to war, believing they were the masters of technology. But when they looked across those roaring assembly lines, they realized they were standing in front of something far greater, not technology, but civilization in motion. From that day on, the laughter stopped. The captured Jeep was no longer a curiosity. It was a symbol, a reminder that the real battlefield wasn't made of sand or steel, but of factories, blueprints, and the will to build without end. And as the engines roared through the night, the German engineers stood in silence, haunted not by defeat, but by the unstoppable rhythm of production, because they finally understood. They weren't fighting an army anymore. They were fighting an industrial civilization, and it could not be bombed, broken, or beaten. The war was over. The factories were silent now. Their furnaces cold, their machines rusting under the gray European sky. The men who had once built the engines of conquest returned home, not as heroes, but as ghosts. Among them were the engineers who had studied that strange American Jeep years before. They had seen the heart of the enemy, and they had learned more from it than from any classroom or commander. Their cities were rubble, their universities bombed, their machines gone, but their minds still worked, and in the ruins, something began to shift. One of them, Karl Weiss, once an officer in the German Army's mechanical division, walked through the shattered streets of Munich. Shops were burned out, the tram lines twisted, the air thick with dust and memory. He stopped beside a half-collapsed workshop. A single word was painted on the wall, half erased by soot. Werkstatt, workshop. Weiss smiled bitterly. That's all we are now, he muttered. A nation of broken workshops. But that night, sitting by candlelight in a basement with a handful of surviving engineers, a new idea took shape. We cannot rebuild the old way, Weiss said quietly. Precision is useless if no one can afford it. We must build simple. We must build fast. The others looked at him, confused, even insulted. German engineers had never used the word simple as a compliment. But Weiss wasn't thinking like an old German anymore. He was thinking like the men who had built the Jeep. Over the next few years, the world watched something extraordinary happen. Germany, the land that had once been buried in ashes, began to hum again. New factories rose, small at first, then larger. New machines, cheap and sturdy, appeared in workshops. Cars that anyone could afford. Tools that anyone could repair. The spirit of the Jeep had crossed the ocean, not as a conqueror, but as a teacher. The same men who had once built the most complicated war machines in history now built Volkswagens, people's cars, simple, reliable, repairable. The same logic that had humbled them in battle now rebuilt their nation in peace. They called it the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. But those who had seen the American factories knew it wasn't a miracle. It was a method. The Jeep had shown them that power isn't about perfection, it's about production. One afternoon in 1953, Weiss stood in a small auto plant outside Stuttgart. A line of young apprentices worked on a car chassis, passing it, down the line, not unlike the American system he had once feared. He watched the rhythm of their hands, the simplicity of the design. No excess, no wasted motion. And suddenly, he smiled. We learned from the enemy, he whispered, and became stronger than before. The lesson spread far beyond Germany. Across Japan, too, engineers rebuilt their industries using the same logic: simplicity, scalability, speed. Within decades, both nations that had once fallen to American industry had become industrial giants themselves, powered by the very idea that had defeated them. That's the irony of history. True defeat can sometimes teach the most lasting victory. The Jeep itself became a legend. Soldiers took it home in photographs. Engineers copied its design, and whole generations of inventors studied its blueprints. But for those who truly understood its story, it wasn't just a machine. It was a mirror, reflecting a truth bigger than war. That sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't made of steel or fire, it's made of thought. Because in the end, what changed the world wasn't the Jeep's four wheels. It was its philosophy. Build simply. Build for everyone. Build so that anyone can fix what's broken. That was the genius the German engineers took home, and it became the foundation for everything that followed, from cars to cameras, from radios to rockets. Years later, when Weiss was an old man, a journalist asked him one question. What was the greatest invention of the war? Weiss didn't hesitate. He looked up at a photograph of a dusty little Jeep on his shelf, the same one that had once made him question everything, and he said softly, the greatest invention was not the Jeep itself, but the idea it carried inside. The idea that design, not destruction, can change the world. The war had begun with engines built for domination. It ended with a lesson built for creation. And that's how the world moved forward, not through conquest but through understanding. So the next time you see that little boxy Jeep, remember, it wasn't just a vehicle, it was a message, a reminder that the simplest designs can outlast empires, and the quietest ideas can reshape history. If this story fascinated you, hit subscribe and stay tuned, because the machines of war often hid the minds that built our modern world. In the next episode, we'll uncover another forgotten story where invention, not destruction, changed the course of history. The war ended. The factories fell silent. But that moment, that Jeep in the desert, stayed burned into their minds. Years later, many of those same German engineers helped rebuild their homeland, using the same lessons they learned from that American Jeep. Simplicity, speed, scale. The very principles that had once defeated them became the ones that helped them rise again. Sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a gun, it's an idea. The Jeep wasn't just a vehicle, it was a message that changed the way the world builds, fights, and thinks. If you love hidden stories like this, subscribe because the next one is even more unbelievable.